Why is it that this debt issue in America has now reached epic proportions where the whole world is watching?
The thing in the United States is that the government has to get approval from Congress in order to raise the debt limit. And when it reaches the limit of that approval, has no authority to borrow unless it gets another approval from Congress. So it's now reaching the limit of $14.3 trillion, right, and it needs new authorization to raise the debt again.
What's the prudence of having a debt ceiling, for instance?
It's been the case in the United States for about 100 years, I think. And it was done as a way of trying to curb government borrowing and to say that it should be the democratically elected representatives of the people who say when the government should borrow. And it seemed like a good idea because it acted as a check on government and allowed the people to comment on what government was doing. It's required the debt ceiling to be raised many, many times. If I remember correctly, it's been almost every couple of years it has to happen. And it's become much more contentious lately.
I mean, obviously, we're concerned about unbridled spending by the government. We're concerned about the effects of quantitative easing, which should have tried to stem this tide. And if we're now asking for a higher debt ceiling, higher than $14 trillion, it does suggest that a lot of the stimulus packages and interventions are not working. Is that a fair comment?
I think so. I mean, if you look at the US economy, it doesn't look like it's doing particularly well, despite all the quantitative easing and despite all the stimulus spending, which really is the cause of the problem, because the stimulus has added to the deficit of the government and required more borrowing.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about these ratings agencies, because Standard & Poor's in particular said that they're putting America on a negative watch for its credit rating. Of all countries, I think America had the most desired credit rating of a AAA, and it's a capital A. You must explain that to me. What's the difference between a capital A, AAA, and a small a?
It depends on the rating agency, but in any event, whether it's big or small a, the point is that the US has the highest rating, and the most credit-worthy borrower in the market has always been assumed to be the US government. If it turns out that they're not the most credit-worthy, that creates at least a question about the basic assumptions on which the whole financial system is based. That's the fear. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that the US, even if it does technically default, will remain in default for a long period of time. Eventually a deal will have to be made. Right. I think it's also important to note this would not be unprecedented. It turns out in 1979, the US did technically default for a short period of time at that point. So,
what does a default mean in this circumstance? Because we're told that they're likely to default on critical areas like healthcare insurance and social security. It's not necessarily on their international obligations.
Right. So what it means is that about the 2nd of August, the US will have not enough money to meet all its obligations to its investors, as well as to the pensioners who depend on their pensions, people who depend on healthcare, the soldiers who are fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it'll have to start making choices about who it pays. And so it's a sense of who do you default to? Do you default to the bondholders, or do you default to the pensioners and the people who are sick and need health care? And that's the government's choice at that point.
The impact on the international financial system, because apparently if America does default, it's going to have immediate bearing on its treasury bills and immediate bearing on its banking system as well.
The problem is that if the US gets close to the default date, or the markets start to think that they're going to default, then the obvious response is to raise interest rates. So that's one consequence. The other consequence is that a lot of banks use treasury bills as a way of, through using various techniques, to finance their ongoing operations, to price their own debt, and so that there'd be many changes that would happen, because now the debt would not be as attractive and as sellable potentially as it used to be. So that and many contracts will be influenced as well, because they're linked in various ways to that.
Okay, you mentioned that this is by some law, that it has to be an act of Congress for the government to lift this borrowing ceiling. Yes, Congress as a chamber that represents the people, I mean, going back to what you said earlier on, but it's now created a bipartisan tension within the Congress, and there's a big fear that there is not going to be a deal, because the Republicans see this issue one way and the Democrats see it another way.
Right. I mean, the Republicans say that you can only raise the debt ceiling if you cut spending at least equally and probably more. And everybody acknowledges that the US fiscal position over the long term is unsustainable. So that change has to come eventually. The question is, should it come now, and should it come in the form only of spending cuts, which is the Republican position, or should it include some tax increases, particularly on wealthy Americans, which is the Democrats' position? Right. I mean, that's a debate, obviously. The Republican position seems to me to be a totally irresponsible position, but that's probably a personal choice.
Let's underscore the word irresponsibility, because we've already been told that with the variety of interventions for bank bailouts, for toxic asset relief programs, stimulus packages, the current generation of Americans will be paying all these debts back through a lifetime of taxes. So to already propose another cycle of tax increases in order to now deal with this debt ceiling suggests that the Democrats are being a little bit irresponsible or insensitive, especially when you look at unemployment rates in America and how sluggish the growth has been.
Right. I mean, everyone acknowledges the situation has to be dealt with. So in that sense, yes, everybody has to do something. The question is, the first question is, should it happen now, or is there more of a need now to stimulate the economy and then to start the cutting a little bit later? And given, as you said, the relatively high unemployment rate, the slow growth in the economy, I would suggest that there's a need now for more stimulus and more focus on jobs and dealing with people with mortgage problems, and then to wait until the economy is more stabilized to start the cutting. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is over the last 20 years, the rich Americans have benefited way disproportionately to the average American. And so that to say now's the time you have to start paying some of that back, at least so that we can preserve Social Security and health care for the poorest Americans, seems at least an equitable principle and fair for the system as a whole.
Can America afford this? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this. A deficit for the year 2011 at $1 trillion. We know that China is a major creditor to the United States. We know there have been concerns about the dollar as a reserve currency, and there's just a sense that they're in no position to be taking some of these additional debts on.
Well, the answer whether it can afford it or not to some extent depends on whether people are willing to lend to it or not. And as long as people are willing to lend, then yes, it can borrow and it can keep the system going. I mean, eventually there will be a reckoning. As I said, that's question number one. Question number two to that is going to be, I still have lost my train of thought on the second part.
I just want to know who, if America can afford it, then you're saying it's okay.
Right.
But what's the broader bearing on the international community? The Chinese have already questioned the sanity of fiscal policy in America. They've questioned why they're holders of treasury bills. They've questioned whether the dollar should be a reserve currency. Right.
I mean, that's the risk. The other thing to think about, though, the other side of that is, what's the alternative? Because if you don't put your money in, if the Chinese or anybody else isn't putting their money into US debt, where would they put it? And if you look at what's happening in Europe today, which would be the natural second choice, that's not particularly attractive. Some of the Asian economies are obviously doing very well, but their markets are not big enough to absorb the huge Chinese surpluses. And so in a sense, the US is lucky in that they don't look good, but there's no one else is looking any better at least on a scale that works at the moment.
Sure.